Hello and welcome to CBSE SST Guide, and I'm your social science mentor. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe. So, today, as you can see, we are going to discuss about nationalism in India, which is the second chapter of the history syllabus of class 10. So, let's take a look. Now, so nationalism in India is quite a huge chapter and a very important one because you can expect 1 markers, 3 markers, and at least 1 5 marker definitely in your board exams from this particular chapter. So, this chapter is very, very important and it is something that you cannot take lightly at all. So, let's look at the first question that is there. It's a 3 marker question. All right, so how is the growth of modern Indian nationalism intimately connected to the anti-colonial movement? It comes as a 3 marker question. So let's have a look. The answer is here. In India, as in many other colonies, the growth of modern nationalism is intimately connected to the anti-colonial government. People began discovering their unity in the process of their struggle with colonialism. So here we see that the growth of Indian nationalism is directly related to the anti-colonial movement, to the colonial government. It's a reaction against the colonial government. So the sense of being oppressed under colonialism provided this shared bond which people felt, and it tied different groups together. But each class and group felt the effects of colonialism differently, their experiences varied, and their notion of freedoms were also very, very different from each other. However, the common goal was to rid themselves of the British colonial government, which was oppressive. And it was under the Congress, the Indian National Congress, particularly under Mahatma Gandhi, who tried to forge these groups together under a common consensus within one movement, right? So this entire paragraph would be your answer to the question, how is Indian nationalism intimately or directly connected to the anti-colonial movement? Moving on, another important 3 marker question, which is very common, is what was the economic and political impact of World War One? I have shortened it and written it. So, of course, you have to write about how the war created new economic and political situations which impacted India rather adversely. Why? Because the defense expenditure for the war was financed by war loans and increasing taxes, and all the custom duties and the taxes were, of course, paid by the Indians themselves. So, at a point of time when the Indians were already suffering, they had to indirectly support the war by providing defense expenditure. So, it impoverished them further. Right through the war years, prices of course increased. So we know that the First World War started. The duration was it started in 1914 and then ended in 1918. So it's a 4 war duration. So at the beginning of 1913, when the war was about to begin, when the politics was brewing, we see that prices rose in double figures, and it led to extreme hardship for the common people. So this was the economic situation, the economic impact of the World War One. As far as the political situation is concerned, we see that villages were forced to call upon to supply soldiers, and forced recruitment sort of, spread a lot of anger. And then in 1918, 1919, there were crops that failed, so that is another economic impact. There was a huge shortage of food. There was the influenza epidemic, just like we're having one now, right? And according to the census of 1921, exactly 100 years ago, 12 to 13 million people perished as a result of famines and epidemic. And this at this stage, people were ready to begin a new mode of struggle, and therefore at this stage precisely we see the entrance of Mahatma Gandhi. So this would suffice for the answer: what was the economic and political impact of World War One? Then, of course, another important three marker question is on Satyagraha. Right now, please also note down one marker questions. So, for example, when did Gandhiji return to India? In January 1915. And where was he before he came to India? He was a lawyer in South Africa. So, these are potential one marker questions. So, as I said, the idea of Satyagraha. So, explain the idea of Satyagraha according to Gandhiji, right? So, in order to, sort of deal with this growing racist regime that was the British, right? Gandhiji devised a new way of a mass agitation, which of course did not have any place for violence, and that was called Satyagraha. Now, if you get a one marker question, you can simply say that the idea of Satyagraha emphasized on the power of truth and the need or the urge to search for truth. So, Satyagraha, you can basically break it down to two words: Satya, which means truth, and Agraha means urge to find, right? So, Agraha, to find the truth or Satya, right? Now, what was this idea of Satyagraha? What does truth have to do anything with political struggles? Now, what Gandhiji essentially suggested, and it was a very novel way of dealing with agitation, is it suggested that if the cause was true, then, and if the cause was true and the struggle was against injustice, then the physical force necessary to apparently fight the oppressor would not be necessary, right? So, without seeking vengeance or being aggressive, a Satyagrahi could win the battle, and it could basically, what it wanted to do was appeal to the conscience or the sense of morality of the oppressors. So, people, including the oppressors, were to be persuaded, not forced, but they will be persuaded themselves to see the truth. And if they themselves see the truth, then there will be no need of force or use of violence, and ultimately truth would win, right? So this paragraph, you have to understand carefully and write the answer, right? So explain the idea of Satyagraha according to Gandhiji. If it again comes as a one marker, as I said, you can simply give this part as the answer, right? Moving on, name two main Satyagraha movements organized by Mahatma Gandhi successfully in favor of peasants. So one, of course, is when he arrived in India in 1917, he traveled to Bihar, Champaran, to inspire the peasants to struggle against the oppressive indigo plantation system. And there was another movement that he organized, was for the peasants in the Kheda district of Gujarat, right? Now, be very careful. If the question clearly mentions peasants, then mention only Champaran and Kheda. Do not mention Ahmedabad. Although there was a Satyagraha movement that Gandhiji planned in Ahmedabad, however, Ahmedabad was not for peasants, it was for cotton mill workers. So if by mistake you write Champaran Ahmedabad or Kheda Ahmedabad, then you 1 mark or half a mark, depending on the marks that is there, will get cut, because it has been mentioned in the question that Satyagraha in favor of peasants. However, if the question comes generally, name two satyagraha movements organized by Mahatma Gandhi, then you can write any of the three. But if only peasants are mentioned particularly, then make sure you are only writing about Champaran and Kheda, right? I'll repeat again, Ahmedabad was only for cotton mill workers. So these little tiny things, make a huge difference. That is why you have to remember it. Now, going forward, Rowlatt Act again is you get a lot of questions on Rowlatt Act, particularly 3 markers. So let's look at the variety of questions that you get for Rowlatt Act. What was the Rowlatt Act and why was it imposed? So here you have to mention the act, right, which was passed in the Imperial Legislative Council, and what was the act about? That government had power to arrest political activists and put them in jail, detain them in jail without any trial for 2 years. And so political prisoners, if they were caught on mere suspicion, they could be put in jail without trial. So that is as good as assuming that the person is guilty without actually having to prove that he is guilty, right? And why was it imposed? It was imposed to curtail the growing political unrest amongst the Indians, right? Another type of question for Rowlatt Act is describe Rowlatt Satyagraha, or how did Indians oppose the Rowlatt Satyagraha? Now, a combination of this two questions can also come, like what was the Rowlatt Act and how did the Indians oppose the Rowlatt Act? So here, of course, you have to mention about the Rowlatt Satyagraha, which Mahatma Gandhi called for. So rallies were organized in various cities. Workers went on strikes, and railway workshops and shops were closed down. So all these particular details and how the British administration decided to clamp down on the satyagrahis, this all has to be mentioned, right? Local leaders were picked up from Amritsar, and Mahatma Gandhi himself was not allowed to enter Delhi. So all of these you have to mention, right? Now, explain the reaction of the Indian people. Again, the answer is the same, right? So this is more or less the variety of questions that can be asked on the same topic, which is Rowlatt Act, right? Now, moving further forward, we come to the next question. Explain what happened at Jallianwala Bagh, or write a short note on Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Now, this is a very direct question, and it's a well-known event, a well-known tragedy that happened in India. So you will start from here. On 10th April, the police in Amritsar fired upon a peaceful procession, provoking widespread attacks on banks, post offices, railway stations. Martial law was imposed and General Dyer took command. So he was the one who gave the order. So on 13th April, the infamous Jallianwala Bagh took place, and we see that during the Baisakhi fair, many villagers, who were unaware of the martial law, they came to Jallianwala Bagh, which was a garden named Jallianwala, right? And Dyer simply entered the area, blocked the exits, and killed hundreds of innocent men, women, and children. And his object was declared later that he wanted to create a shock and awe campaign, to produce a moral effect where the Indians would not dare protest against the mighty British Empire out of fear. Obviously, we see that this was not only grossly inhuman, but it also backfired on the British government, because after Jallianwala Bagh, it produced a huge reaction, not only by the Indians, but also around the world. People were shocked that the British could do such a inhuman attack, right? So Jallianwala Bagh Satyagraha, if a question comes, you can write about how they sort of reacted, right? Now, overtly we saw that because the Jallianwala Bagh massacre was so unprovoked and so cruel in nature, people, started moving away from being non-violent, and violent incidents sort of started cropping up. And that is the reason why, seeing the violence, Mahatma Gandhi called off the movement. Now, here you may get a question, what was the specific reason why Gandhiji called off the non-cooperation, the non-cooperation movement? So here, of course, you have to mention the Chauri Chaura, right? So where is it mentioned? Let's just have a look. Yes, here, right? So the Chauri Chaura incident. Now, this is particularly not given in the text form in the main chapter. That is why students have difficulty finding out the answer. Although students know, but just to be sure, this is where it is written. So in the 2021 edition of NCERT, page 37, right? What was the main reason to withdraw the non-cooperation movement? So at Chauri Chaura in Gorakhpur, a peaceful demonstration in the bazaar turned violent, and hearing this incident, Mahatma Gandhi called a halt to the non-cooperation movement. And of course, the reason being, he stated that people were not yet ready to be satyagrahis and more training was required, right? So this is why, this is the main reason why the non-cooperation movement was stopped so abruptly, right? Let's now enter the main non-cooperation movement, right? So let's have a look at that. So more or less we have up until now we have discussed this part. Now entering 1919, 1920, a very important question is, why was the Khilafat movement started? Right? So the Khilafat issue was basically, here you have to give a background, and students sometimes get confused about this, right? So the background was that in the First World War, now we've already discussed the First World War, right? So by 1918, 1919, the First World War was already over. And among the Axis powers who lost the war, one of them was the Ottoman Empire, right? Modern day Turkey and some other adjacent areas. Ottoman Empire was huge at the time. So the Ottoman Emperor was not only the political head of the empire, of course, but he was the spiritual head of the Islamic world. Something, like the Christian Pope. So the Muslim equivalent, the Islamic equivalent is the Caliph or the Khalifa, right? And his powers were taken away, and there was a harsh peace treaty that was imposed on the Ottoman Empire, where the emperor had to let go of this post. And of course, in order to defend the Khalifa's temporal as well as spiritual powers, a Khilafat committee was formed in Bombay. By who? Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali, because obviously it was such an insult to Muslims around the world. Even Indian Muslims, were indignant of the fact that the Khalifa was insulted in such a manner. And that is why the Khilafat movement started. And here Gandhiji, the reason why non-cooperation movement was clubbed together with the Khilafat movement was because Gandhiji saw the possibility of a united front where the Muslims, under the umbrella of a united national movement, could bring together both the Hindus and the Muslims, and nobody would feel alienated, right? So that is why the Khilafat movement was started. So here you have to particularly mention the case of the Khalifa's position, losing his position in Ottoman Turkey after his defeat in First World War, and then of course Gandhiji taking it up as issue worthy of being clubbed together with mass agitation in India against the British, right? So it's like having a common enemy. So the Ottoman Empire's common enemy, of course, with India was the British, right? So when now, if you get a question on when was this decision of supporting or starting a non-cooperation movement with the Khilafat issue started, in which session, then the answer would be at the Calcutta session of the Congress in September 1920. Again, this is a potential one marker, right? Now, moving on, another important one marker is who is the author of Hind Swaraj, right? So, of course, the answer is Mahatma Gandhi, right? Okay, moving further on, we see that now, as far as non-cooperation movement is concerned, the board asks questions on the basis of participation of various groups of people. Among them is the middle class participation in the non-cooperation movement. I have shortened it down, non-cooperation movement, NCM, to save space. So describe middle class participation in non-cooperation movement and exactly why did it slow down. So we see that of course the movement started in the cities. Another way you can get this question is how did the city dwellers participate in the non-cooperation movement? So don't get confused, the answer would be the same. Middle class and city dwellers, the same thing, right? So please make sure you remember these groups, because these groups are picked up, these social groups are picked up, and then on the basis of that, their particular participation wise, the question is asked on non-cooperation movement, right? Another one marker from within here would be asked, like which party did not take part or did not boycott during the non-cooperation movement? It would be the Justice Party, right? Okay, now moving on, the middle class participation in the cities, we see that foreign goods were boycotted, liquor shops were picketed, etc., and its value dropped from 102 crore to 57 crores, and many places merchants and traders refused to trade in foreign goods, right? And only khadi was picked up, and the production of Indian textiles, mills and handlooms went up. So this would be your answer to middle class participation, right? Where thousands of students left government controlled schools, colleges, headmasters and teachers resigned, and lawyers gave up their legal practices. Now, why did it slow down? The reason why it slowed down in the cities, of course, was because of the fact that khadi was a more expensive alternative than mass produced mill cloth, because it was produced by human labor, so it took a lot of time and it took a lot of effort. That is why khadi was more expensive than the cheap mass machine produced mill cloth. So it was very, very expensive and a lot of people could not afford it. At the same time, there was another situation that cropped up. All the students and the teachers, the lawyers, the government workers who left, the judges, all of them who left their place of work and place of education, there was no alternative, right? For the movement to be successful, there was no alternative Indian institutions at the time. So they had to be set up in place of British ones in order for, these flux of students, teachers, judges, etc., to move into the indigenous places of work. But however, because there was no alternative, the people who were protesting were forced back to go back into the British institutions, because obviously, like, how long can you stay jobless, right? So a matter of livelihood came up, right? The next, of course, question is describe the spread of non-cooperation movement in the countryside, right? Now, as far as the countryside is concerned, you have to mention that a huge number of peasants and tribals, were drawn to the non-cooperation movement? How did they particularly, their understanding of freedom was against the oppression that landlords dealt with them, and the begar work, the free labor that they had to give forcefully, right? And of course, especially you have to mention the way the Awadh peasants struggle, sort of um, intensified, right? It developed forms, and the movement spread in 1921. Houses of talukdars and merchants were attacked. So basically, this paragraph, right? You have to mention. This is where you would get the answer to peasant participation or countrywide participation, right? Now, many one markers are here. Peasants were led by who? Baba Ramchandra, a sannyasi who was indentured labor in Fiji. And then, of course, you can get a 3-marker question on peasant rebellion and movement in Awadh particularly. Then, who headed the Awadh Kisan Sabha? It was by Jawaharlal Nehru and Baba Ramchandra. So these are a few 1-marker questions to look into, right? Now, the next question that is there was tribal participation. Now, another question can be describe the or analyze the participation of tribals in the non-cooperation movement, or how did the tribals interpret Mahatma Gandhi's idea of Swaraj, right? So here particularly you have to mention about the tribals in the Gudan Hills of Andhra Pradesh, the militant guerrilla movement that spread under the leadership of Alluri Sitaraman Raju. And although he claimed that he claimed that he had divine powers, and the rebels sort of proclaimed he was an incarnation of God, and he was inspired by the non-cooperation movement led by Gandhiji. However, he said that only violent revolution, could bring about, a use of force was necessary to get rid of the British. Non-violence would not do. However, the paths were different, but the goal was the same. So, a different question that can come is, who was Alluri Sitaraman Raju and what was his contribution to the tribal movement? So, you can definitely write this part as your answer. Next, plantation workers were another social group. So the question sometimes can be picked up as, the plantation workers in Assam had their own understanding of Mahatma Gandhi and the notion of Swaraj. Explain. So here you have to understand that for the workers, the notion of Swaraj was simple, as simple as, being able to leave the tea gardens and have a visit at home, and to get better wages, right? So their idea of Swaraj was, right to move freely, as you can see, and meant, retaining a link with the village from where they had come, because the plantation workers who worked in, northeast part of India, mainly they were of course from Assam, but also they were also from Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, Bengal, those regions, and they were never allowed to go home, right? And here, this act, the Inland Immigration Act, right? So what was the Inland Immigration Act, or which act did not permit plantation workers to leave the tea garden without permission, right? So under the Inland Immigration Act, plantation workers were not permitted to leave the tea gardens without permission, and they were rarely given such permission. So basically they were slaves. In other ways, we can say that they were slaves under the British rule, and they longed, the plantation workers longed for freedom. So their idea of Swaraj was freedom from the confines of the plantation, right? And they believed that Gandhi Raj was coming, and everyone would be given land in their own villages. Longing for home, we can see here, is a part of the greater idea of freedom, right? Of course, there were strikes held and they were caught by the police and they were brutally beaten up. This was the reaction. So when a question comes about plantation workers and their understanding of Swaraj or their participation, then you can write this part of the question as the answer, right? Um, so moving on further, we come to the civil disobedience movement. We see here one marker question: who formed the Swaraj Party? C.R. Das and Motilal Nehru, right? Moving forward, let's go to main questions. Of course, yes, Simon Commission, right? So, what was Simon Commission? And why were the Indians against it, right? So this is in page 38 of the 2021 edition of the NCERT book. Simon Commission arrived in India specifically to you know, in response to the national movement. It was going to look into the function of the constitution system in India and suggest changes, right? But it did not have a single Indian member, and that is why the Indians were against it. So go back Simon slogan in 1928, when Sir John Simon, when he came to India, he was met with these flags. So when you get a question, what was the Simon Commission? Why were Indians against it? So this portion would be the answer, right? Moving further on, you may get a question on Lahore Congress. When was Purna Swaraj declared? Where? So you can write about the Lahore Congress. When was the Purna Swaraj declared? On 26 January 1930, and it was celebrated as the Independence Day. And people were to take a pledge to struggle for complete independence, right? Next, moving on to the Salt March. So the type of question that comes here is, which were the two types of demands mentioned by Gandhiji in his letter to Viceroy Irwin on 31st January 1930? So here you can definitely say that there was an 11 demands, 11 points that he wanted. Specifically, the idea was for everyone, you know, to reduce the salt tax, right? And the other was that India should be given freedom. So Mahatma Gandhi's letter was in a way an ultimatum, right? However, Irwin was unwilling to negotiate, right? And this is what led to the Dandi March, right? So now another question is, why was abolition of salt tax most stirring, right? The reason why salt tax, Gandhiji particularly picked up the salt tax, was because salt was something, you know, it is a ubiquitous item that is used by everyone and anyone, be it rich, poor, everyone uses it. And if the salt tax therefore could be used as a sort of a bringing together point where everyone could relate to this kind of oppression where even salt was taxed, and of course the monopoly of salt production, right? Gandhiji also wanted to get rid of the British monopoly. Here what it meant was only the British could produce salt and no one else, and this is exactly what Gandhiji did. How did he break the salt tax? When we say civil disobedience movement, it's not about just non-cooperation but also particularly breaking laws, and he broke this salt law, right? He marched for over 240 miles from Sabarmati to the Gujarat coastal town of Dandi, and the volunteers walked for 24 days, and thousands came, and on 6th April he reached Dandi and ceremonially violated the law, manufactured salt by boiling seawater, right? So this is the way in which he broke laws, and therefore he initiated a civil disobedience where not only was he not cooperating but also breaking laws. He was being disobedient. So this is the meaning of civil disobedience, right? Now this is the answer to the question, explain the Dandi March. Further coming down, we see that why did Gandhiji call off the civil disobedience movement? This part is the answer, right? Where Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan was arrested, and there were demonstrators, angry crowds who demonstrated, and they were facing armored crowds and police firing. Many were killed. Gandhiji himself was arrested. Industrial workers in Sholapur attacked police posts. So it was becoming very violent in nature. And peaceful satyagrahas on the other end was brutally repressed. Women and children were beaten, and at least 100,000 people were arrested. And in this situation, Mahatma Gandhi decided to call off the movement, and this resulted in the Gandhi-Irwin Pact. Now you can get a 1-marker question. What is the Gandhi-Irwin Pact? Here Gandhiji consented to participate in the Round Table Conference, right? And in the conference, negotiations happened, right? Of course, they broke down, right? Now moving further on, as far as participation again of social groups are concerned about civil disobedience movement, you will definitely write about now what are the the civilian groups and the social groups who participated in the civil disobedience movement. They were, of course, the question can come as illustrate the role of rich peasant communities in the civil disobedience movement. So here you have to talk about the Patidas of Gujarat and Jats of Uttar Pradesh, and how they refused to, pay such high taxes and revenue demands, and were reluctant, to pay, and that is why they were enthusiastic supporters of the civil disobedience movement, right? Next, the poorer peasantry. However, again, if you get a question, the poorer peasantry, why they were not interested? It is because they were small tenants, and they had a direct antagonizing, they had an antagonistic relation with the landlords, right? They not only wanted reduction of taxes, but also they found difficult to pay their rent. So they wanted unpaid rent to the landlord to be remitted. Now, obviously, this was against the interest of the rich peasant communities, and that is why there was a clash between the poorer peasantry and the landlord community, right? That is why they were very apprehensive in taking part, because their individual interests sort of did not match. And the Congress at the other end was also unwilling to support the no rent campaign in case they angered the rich peasant community. And that is why, as far as poor peasants are concerned, the Congress's stance was uncertain. In a similar vein, we also see this antagonistic relationship between the business class and the working class. So while the business class, now as far as the question, how did the business class support the civil disobedience movement, we see that the answer would, so you have to mention this entire part, right? They gave financial assistance, refused to buy or sell imported goods, and they demanded that colonial policies that restricted business activities be sort of stopped, and they be given protection against import of foreign goods. For that reason, the FICCI, Federation of Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industries, was formed, and this is how they lended support. And many businessmen, sort of saw Swaraj as a time when colonial restrictions on business would no longer exist, right? And industry would flourish without constraints. However, again, at the same time, we see that the working class, for them, it did not matter whether the business class were getting rich or not, because their position of being oppressed remained the same. That is why when the industrialists were getting closer to the Congress, the workers stayed aloof, because what the workers demanded was higher wages, which again was against the interest of the business classes. They did not want to give higher wages to the workers, and that is why we see that the workers did not participate. So there were strikes by railway workers and dock workers, and thousands of workers in tin mines, wore Gandhi caps. So they did take up certain, symbols of the civil disobedience movement and protested. However, there was this sort of reluctance by the Congress to add all workers' demands as part of the program for struggle, because they felt that it would again alienate the industrialists. Right? Now, explain the role. The next question is explain the role of women in civil disobedience movement. Right? So here you would talk about how women came out of their homes. So they did not merely see themselves as wives and mothers, but also as individuals themselves who went to jail, who picketed foreign cloth and liquor shops. So they were physically present. Many of them, went to jail, in quoted jail too. And however, Gandhiji was convinced that the duty of women were to look after the home and be good mothers and good wives. And for a long time, Congress were reluctant to add women, but we see women had created the space on their own to say that they were individuals themselves and they could be part and parcel of freedom struggle as much as men can. Right? So this would be your answer to women's participation. Now, as far as limits of civil disobedience movement, mainly two limits are there. One is the lack of Dalit, sort of representation, and therefore Dalit participation. Now, the reason why the Congress ignored the Dalit was, again, it would attract, conservative high caste Hindus' ire. They would not want the high caste Hindus, the Congress feared, would not want the Dalits, right? And that is why Mahatma Gandhi, we see later on, he starts the Harijan movement to eliminate untouchability, right? Many Dalit leaders like B.R. Ambedkar, however, took different paths. So here you can get a question and describe the main features of Pune Pact. So Dr. B.R. Ambedkar organized the Dalits separately into a depressed class association. However, Gandhiji felt that it would further alienate. If electorates were separate for Dalits and other general castes, then it would further alienate alienate the people of India, and that is why Gandhiji began a fast unto death. And finally, the Pune Pact of September 1932 gave the depressed classes reserved seats in provincial and central legislative councils, not separate electorates. Right? Now, explain any three reasons for the lukewarm response of the Muslim organizations for civil disobedience movement. Again, of course, we see the answer is here. We see that the Congress became, the reason why the Muslims felt alienated is because the Congress came visibly associated with Hindu religious nationalist groups, and as a result, Hindus and Muslims, the relationship between them worsened. We see there were Hindu-Muslim communal clashes and riots that were provoked. And of course, the Congress and Muslim League sort of made efforts to renegotiate, but we see that a unity in the end could not be forged. Right? And of course, here we see that negotiations over separate electorates were made, and Jinnah sort of was willing to give up the demand for separate electorate, but all hope of resolving the issue at the all parties conference sort of disappeared. Why, if the question is asked? When? Because M.R. Jakar of the Hindu Mahasabha strongly opposed. Right? So this sort of wraps up the question answers as far as the movements are concerned. Now we look at national movement per se, or nationalism, right? So very important question that is asked, a 5-marker question is asked, is how did cultural processes help in creating a sense of collective belongingness in India? So here you have to mention 4 key subheadings and then elaborate each one of them. One is the image of Bharat Mata, right? So this you would get here, the image of Bharat Mata that was created by Abanindranath Tagore, and we see that Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay's a book on Anandamot, sort of gave this imaginary, status, and of course a mother figure of um, India sort of was created through the song Vande Mataram, and later, she became popular through paintings, and Bharat Mata later was recreated many times through popular prints, painters, etc. Right? So this was one way in which an image and figure of motherland sort of uh, lent everyone uh, you know a, a concept of a mother figure where people could relate to a motherland, because the concept of nationalism is abstract, right? So how can you relate to it when you have a image which you can associate with that abstract feeling of nationalism? So Bharat Mata was equal to that feeling of nationalism. Next is of course folk tales and traditions, right? So folk tales and traditions, Indian nationalists began to record and collect folk tales and bards, because we see that the writers and the nationalists believed that the traditions and the culture, the literature, indigenous literature actually belonged within the folk tales. Here you can give the example of Rabindranath Tagore, who collected rhymes and poems and books and stories, and Natesha Sastri in South Indian Madras. He made a collection of Tamil folk tales in the folklore of South India. The next point that you can add is of course the creation of national flag, where we see that again an image of India is being created, right? So here you will get the answer. First, the Swaraj flag, right? That was designed by Gandhiji himself, and of course the very early flag of the Swadeshi movement. Now you may get a question, what type, separate 3-marker question, what type of flag was designed during the Swadeshi movement in Bengal? So here you have to talk about the tricolor flag, red, green, yellow, and the 8 lotuses. So this part would be the answer. You may also get a 1-marker question, describe the colors, or what were the colors of the tricolor flag during the Swadeshi movement? Red, yellow, green. So these colors you have to remember, right? Okay. Next, moving on, the 4th point to the question of collective belongingness is the Indian nationalist interpretation of history. Here you have to mention how the British had created a history where Indians were backward and primitive and incapable of governing themselves. However, in response, Indian historians, in order to instill a sense of pride, wrote about the glorious developments in ancient times, art and architecture, science, mathematics, religion, culture, law, philosophy, etc., and sort of showed that Indians in the ancient and medieval times had huge, great civilization, and decline only came when India was colonized. So a new narrative was created for history writing, where Indians would feel proud about their past, because it is the past that gives people identity. And the same thing for country as well. It is the past that gives the country an identity, and an identity that one can be proud of. So nationalist history was created. So these were the efforts. So these are the main 4 points that you have to mention and discuss when you're writing the answer for how did cultural processes help in creating a sense of collective belongingness in India. Right? So this chapter is quite big. So that is why I have created a timeline as well, which you can see here, right? So you can definitely note down the timeline. So it starts from 1914, 1918 World War One, and then of course ends with 1942 Cripps Mission, Quit India movement. So you can use this to sort of get a sense of the events and exactly at which point of the time these particular events took place. Right now you have maps also, so important centers of Indian national movement. Right, so the question that usually comes is, the question will come as locating or labeling or identifying. Right, so mark the place where satyagraha of indigo planters took place, so you have to mark here and write Champaran. Right, or where did the Jallianwala Bagh incident take place, so you have to write about Amritsar. Right, so these are the important centers for Indian national movement. And the other is important centers for Indian National Congress. You have Madras, Nagpur and Calcutta. Right, so these are the important maps that are important for map marking, which comes separately as 5 marks. Right, so at least 1 or 2 marks will definitely be allotted for Nationalism in India chapter in your boards. Right, so here more or less we have covered the chapter Nationalism in India. I hope it has helped you. You can look at this video and the other videos of civics chapters that I have covered, and do not forget to like and subscribe. Thank you.